Hello, everyone, and welcome to Just Jules. I am Just Jules, and I'm here today with another video. Today I'm switching it up. I will be continuing my series on human rights and human trafficking, but I wanted to switch it up a bit and read you a story of mine from the anthology Forest of the Dark. This was published in, let's see, I think it was 2019, nope, 2018. And by Enchanted Anthologies, published in 2018. And my story is called The Hanging Trees. Now, I am, a former horror author. After essentially living a horror story of my own, I opted not to continue writing horror stories, although I had got plenty of ideas for them. But that was always my niche, is the horror genre. And Stephen King was my freaking hero. I remember I think it was like 5th grade, we had to do a book report, or not a book report, but a book report, and dress up as the author. And I chose Stephen King because Stephen King, he is awesome. Now, my work pales in comparison to the king of horror. Literally, the king. I love Stephen King. My interests are so varied, it's not even funny. I have very eclectic tastes. I've actually taken to rewriting fairy tales and writing my own fairy tales. So I'll share those one with you at a later point. I gotta figure out how to. I'll have to read it off my tablet onto the phone and stuff, but I gotta actually dig it up and find it first. But it's that one I'm pretty proud of. Needs editing though. So I got my coffee. You got your coffee? Get your coffee. Get your coffee. Grab your smokes. And sit down and enjoy. The Hanging Trees by J.V. Stanley. Alexis, do you think it's wise for you to go running off like this in the woods by yourself, especially after what happened? I just don't think it's a good idea for you to be alone right now. Justine's tone of voice offered genuine concern through the receiver. I know she felt guilty for setting Peter and I up in the first place, after what he did. I was also surprised she was still talking to him. Breakups were bad, but they were far worse when you were dating someone in your circle of friends who ended up cheating on you with someone else in the circle. Everyone was trying to be a true friend and show their support, but were often showing their support through neutrality. I didn't blame them. I just didn't want anything getting back to Peter about how I was taking it. The last thing I wanted from him was pity. I'll be fine. I just need to get out and clear my head. Being close to nature helps me put things into perspective. You're going there to write about this, aren't you? I'm totally going to be a character in your book, aren't I? You can use my real name if you want. I laughed, readjusting the phone between my ear and my shoulder. I'm doing research for an article I have to write. It's only coincidence I'm even going out there. I placed the last of my clothes in my backpack and grunted when I lifted up from the floor. Nice grunt. You taking your entire wardrobe with you, or what? Justine laughed over at her own joke, and I grunted more as I hoisted the bag to the apartment door. Get something with wheels, will ya? I scoffed. Wheels are for wussies. Yeah, tell me that when you're 40 and having back issues, she replied. Well, I don't see you over here helping out, do I? So I can see you on the nightly news? No way. I want you to stay home where you won't be some hillbilly sex slave. Better a sex slave for a banjo-playing redneck than Peter's girlfriend. Bitter much? I held the phone to my chest and prayed she couldn't hear my hammering heart. It wasn't her fault Peter cheated on me, and she could just as easily call Peter and cheer him up instead of me. But she didn't walk in on them either. That image is tattooed in my mind forever. I never saw it come and was completely blindsided. My two best friends, who I'd known since grade school. I sighed loudly. Listen, I still have a lot of packing to do, I lied. Mind if I call you back later on tonight? Sure, honey, whatever you need. Just don't forget to bring your extra battery pack to charge your phone. I'll be calling in to check on you. You know what they say about those woods. You don't have your parents around to keep an eye on you. Her abrupt silence told me everything. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean. I rolled my eyes. Thanks, I appreciate it, I said flatly before I hung up. I barely even heard her say goodbye before I shut it off completely as an act of defiance. What part of left alone doesn't anyone seem to understand? I just wanted me and my words and the quiet of the woods. The mention of my parents stung a little, and I was well aware of where I was going and what it was going to mean. Within the hour, I had packed and managed to Tetris everything into the trunk of my car and head to the Ottawa National Forest. I found a place to park my car in the gravel lot and shut off the engine. There was a camper parked closest to the woods, while an SUV was parked in the same row. I sat for a moment, staring out of the front window at the green grass, the giant leaves of burdock bulging from the surrounding trees. Here and there I spotted a few buttercups, dandelions, Queen Anne's lace, and rows upon rows of yellow tansies. My therapist told me to be more mindful, so I sat there for a few moments, counting the leaves upon the great oak, poplar, and birch trees. It was beautiful, and I felt a wave of calm roll upon me like a sheer light fabric, releasing my soul with every gentle rush of wind that blew through my open windows. I sighed heavily, twisting the keys into the ignition, and then rolled the windows up. I put my hand on the lumbar part of my back and arched it, stretching out the tension from the drive. My Ford Fusion didn't exactly have the most comfortable bucket seats. I started feeling a dull ache of betrayal bubbling inside my heart, and I felt the salty heat of tears as they threatened to fall. I blinked them back and tried to focus on the woods around me. The cursed woods. I let out a half-hearted chuckle. Haunted. Cursed. It's the place people go when they want to die. I closed my eyes. I inhaled through my nose and exhaled through my mouth, relaxing my tense shoulders, forcing them down. The feeling was unnatural. The tension, the deadliness of my own, for my writing loomed like a Goliath. My heart hammered. I could feel it in my ears as my mind exploded with the string of things I needed to do. I need to focus on my work. No more men. It's time for me to heal, I thought, forcing myself to hear the logic in my mantra. The air was dry. I took another deep breath through my nose and felt the heat of the sun scorching the insides of it. The cart felt like an oven. Glad I brought water. The weather forecast predicted dry, sunny weather in the upper 80s. I looked at my feet and kicked up dust with the toes of my sandals and walked to the trunk of my car to grab my backpack. I knew where to go. Peter had brought me there once, but we'd never stepped within the square. The hanging trees. 4 large 175-year-old maple trees were sitting in a perfect square right within a large clearing in the middle of the woods. It was said that the trees surrounded a portal to hell embodied within the ancient demon, the collected lives of those who were hung upon the branches of the 4 maples. Those who walked within the square became possessed by the demon, yet upon exiting the square they were freed. Other stories told of a set of trees whose branches wove together to build a natural gazebo. It was there where a man and woman had been married in secret, but before they were able to say I do to the woman's former lover, appeared out of the darkness and killed them both. Before they died, he strung them up in the branches. Later, it was said, slaves had been hung and then public executions, and from there, many forlorn individuals would willingly swing on their branches from a necklace made of rope. It was autumn when Peter had taken me camping just outside the tree square, and I marveled at those 4 beautiful maples and how their interwoven branches created a canopy over a bright square of fresh green grass. It was the first time I had been out there since my parents had passed away. Despite the superstitions, we would go anyway with the excitement of possibility driving us more than the Honda Civic we used to get there. How Peter loved living on the edge, or at least dangling from it. I was caught in his energy, his whirlwind of passion and philosophy, pulling me into a dance within his words. I'd eaten them all, every single one, and savored the delicate way his lips curled around each and every word he spoke. I remember the way he'd keep his soot-black hair combed back in short waves, with a few stray curls framing his face. His eyes were a pale blue, like the color of the afternoon sun, hidden by pale gray clouds. His features appeared as though he were carved with a razor, with cheekbones slightly uneven but sharp. I had believed every word he said. He made me feel safe. How could I be afraid of a place when such an extraordinary, radiant soul was sitting right next to me? It had been the last time he and I were together, a week before I walked in on him. I saw him clearly in my mind until I blinked and I realized I was still staring at my backpack and my open trunk. I clenched my eyes shut and shook my head, trying to force the memory out of my head. I needed to focus on my story. Hoisted my backpack and slung it over my shoulder, and the weight of it made me feel shorter. The weight paled in comparison to the weight of my heart as it sat like a boulder in my rib cage. I sighed. Was I torturing myself? Ignoring the lump within my throat and the feeling of foreboding in my gut, I turned and made my way down the foot-worn trail. I reached the open clearing within roughly 45 minutes. Pools of sweat dripped down my forehead as I hiked, and I wiped the moisture with the bottom of my shirt, which became slightly damp. I was sweating so bad that I honestly felt like I had just gotten out of the shower and decided to put on my clothes without drying off first. I didn't care. I didn't care I wasn't wearing any makeup. I didn't care my dark ash blonde hair was full of flyaway hairs and framed my face like a Medusa of frizzy snake-like waves. I didn't care my eyes were still rimmed with red from crying as I trudged over the gnarled roots and branches that littered the trail, or passing by the thin branches that left a few pale scratches on my arms as I brushed past them. I let the backpack fall from my shoulders onto the ground and arched my back and groaned, thankful to be rid of the weight. I already dreaded the trek back. I grabbed my BPA-free water bottle and downed the first half. I let it slip through my hand and drop to the ground where it landed with a dull thump on the grass. I then stood over my backpack with my hands on my hips, surveying the area. I didn't want to set up camp where Peter and I had. I could see it from where I stood, directly across the clearing. I could see the wine-colored corduroy blanket upon the grass where Peter and I snuggled. We had a campfire crackling near the blanket, and our tent was set up on the left-hand side. Peter had set up a small card table to the right where we had our meals. I protested because I thought the extra weight unnecessary, but it was a luxury he wanted me to have. I saw from a distance the way he had caressed my chin before planting a delicate kiss upon my lips, right upon my Cupid's bow. He said it was his favorite place to kiss me. I closed my eyes and the memory burned behind my eyelids until I opened them, and it was gone. It took me about a half hour to set up my camp. I only brought the essentials, nothing special. I just craved the silence, and part of me craved the memory of him. It felt like death, like a part of me had shifted into a realm where nothing else existed but the pain of bittersweet memories. It was the happiest of memories we mourned the most because at one point in time or another, it wasn't always so bad. There were smiles and laughter, secrets told beneath soft sheets and whispers in the dark. There were inside jokes like the one we had regarding the guy who used to stalk me back when I was waitressing. I used to work at a family restaurant roughly 5 years ago, and I had unwittingly told the dishwasher, Jim, that I would date him if my boyfriend at the time and I broke up. Coincidentally, a month later, we broke up, and I started dating Peter. I remember James walking up to me while I was on break, sitting in a booth at the back of the restaurant. A day after Peter and I had announced that we were an item, James looked pissed. "So I heard you are with Peter now," he said. The entirety of his flesh was pockmarked from his face to his back and lower extremities. I remember watching him bend to clean the floor drains in the pantry. The way he hunched over left his lower back and butt crack exposed, revealing hundreds of pulsating globs of yellow buried underneath his skin, threatening to burst. I cringed every time I'd pass by him. All I could do was apologize, but it wasn't enough. James stormed away and never so much as spoke to me again, save for a few dark glances in my direction. I had told Peter about the exchange, and he teased me about it ever since. "It'd be like snuggling a twisted kind of bubble wrap, wouldn't it?" he asked with a devilish grin. My jaw dropped in disgust and morbid amazement. "I cannot believe you just said that." Peter simply laughed uproariously at my wide-eyed expression, and thus Jim's secret nickname stuck, Captain Bubble Wrap. I felt such guilt from betraying my word and helping coin the name we referred to him as, but I wasn't attracted to him. He was annoying, repulsive, didn't shower regularly, and just wasn't my type. I felt bad for him. I don't think he ever had a girlfriend at that point, and I know he'd really liked me. I just didn't know how to shoot him down. I hated that because I knew his feelings would be hurt. In retrospect, I probably should have been upfront and honest with him instead. And every time Peter would refer to him by his nickname, I would feel a pang of guilt. Jim didn't deserve it. He was just a lonely soul looking for love just as much as I was. It just took me 5 years to realize it. Maybe he would have been a better choice, despite his ghoulish appearance. I took a few moments to roll out my sleeping bag in the tent and sprawl out on my stomach with the shades drawn to allow the sunlight to filter through. I rested my head on my knuckles, my elbows fanned out on either side of my head. It felt hotter in the tent than it did outside, 81 degrees, with a light breeze outside, stirring the already restless long grass in the clearing. I watched as the wind bent the blades and listened to the rushing sound of the trees as they readjusted themselves with the passing wind. My eyes went to the four maples. They were beautiful, and the branches were woven together like a large canopy reaching high into the heavens. The width of the trees was astonishing. No other tree in the area was as monolithic as any of these four. I could wrap my arms around the trunk of each and reach the outstretched hands of someone else if they were to stand on the other side. The grass was considerably greener than the rest of the clearing and was covered with daisies, their heads lolling from the small gusts. It was so quaint, they appeared to be agreeing to some secret. I noticed what looked like long, dark rivers of sap oozing out of large cracks in the bark of the two facing me and wondered if the other two appeared the same way. Curious, I crawled out of the tent and walked barefoot toward the trees. Pardon me. I walked slowly along the perimeter, which seemed larger than it did from far away, significantly larger. I had expected it to be about half the size when I walked up to it, but here it was, roughly 20 by 20 feet, I would wager. It would have been a beautiful place to get married, with how the branches twisted and braided together. Even the sap running thick, sticky trails down the bark looked beautiful. I found my way to the maple facing my camp and reached out to stroke the sap upon the tree. The texture was not what I expected. It felt hard like bone, which wouldn't be so curious if it weren't for the fact that when I pulled my fingers away, it was wet with what looked like blood. I stumbled backward into the square and quickly reached down and wiped my fingers upon the tall, supple grass to get the substance off. A feeling of dread came over me, and the sun suddenly disappeared behind a cloud that wasn't there before, and the scenery around me turned to a dull, muted gray. The gray took shape and became a mist that covered the top of the grass and rolled over into my camp. I blinked, or at least I thought I had. It was just a simple, natural reflex that would divide my vision from the world in less time than it would take to draw a sharp breath, which is exactly what I did upon opening them. It was autumn, and there was a reddish hue upon the horizon as the sun fell behind the trees, catching them on fire with its fading light. Then everything else began burning, and I was in the middle of a forest fire with felled trees beside me in a mass of flames. I looked at the man suddenly before me, his left arm outstretched and flailing, trying to latch onto my shoulder, while the other nursed a wound upon his stomach. The man was young, barely out of his teens, with dark, disheveled hair and brown eyes that screamed bewilderment and fear. He stumbled toward me while I stood with my feet firmly planted, ready for him to lunge. Within my gut, all I could see was red, pure red hatred and spite. The man reached out for me again, this time with his bloodied right hand extending toward my face. And then I was under the maple, but I was younger. We'd come to this place when I was 5 with my parents. I had forgotten. I suppose one couldn't hold on to every memory, but this memory was different. It was something that was buried, something I didn't want to remember. I looked at my mom smiling in the sunshine. She had hair like spun silk, brown with golden highlights, like mine. Her eyes were large and looked as though they could see the world in one glance. They were wise eyes, the kind that make me feel safe when I looked into them, especially during those times in my life when I needed guidance. It was my mom who showed me the way. Her cheeks were full and kissable, and one thing I loved most of all was coming up behind her while she was sitting and resting my head on her shoulder to caress my cheek against hers. It was our special hug. My father, on the other hand, was a man of impeccable taste. He wore dress shirts, even out in the middle of the woods on a hike. My father was wearing a pale blue button-down shirt that brought out the color in his eyes. His hair was already graying by his temples, but I thought it made him look more sophisticated. He was a good man with honor and integrity. They were both writers of campy horror stories, and I yearned for the day when I would follow in their footsteps. I stumbled over the twisted knots of roots and large rocks on the path. I remember something catching my eye, like a quick, dark flash by the brush closest to the clearing. A long, sad shadow lingering upon the ground, swaying in tempo to the breeze. I heard my mother scream, my father yelling no, and the hum of crickets and cicadas in the thatches. My mom lunged toward me and wrapped her arms around my head, pressing my head awkwardly into her breast. I couldn't breathe, so I fought against her tight grasp and managed to wriggle free, and then I saw it. Sam! My father screamed. My Uncle Sam, my father's brother, had been dangling from a short rope atop one of the large branches connecting the maples. The memory hit me like a battering ram to my chest. At that moment between the real world and the memory of trees, I could taste this familiar bile in the back of my throat as I remembered the way his face contorted, his expression and his eyes bulging from his blue-gray head with worm-like veins drawing a map of where the route of his life used to flow. I heard my mother gasp when she realized that I had witnessed. "It's okay, baby. It's okay," she whispered in my ear, using her hands to try to shield my eyes. She started walking me backward toward the trail where we had just come, but between her fingers I could see my dad rolling the log my uncle had used to hoist himself up into the noose. My father had a knife in his hand to cut him down, and I watched him struggle on the small rotting log, teeter-tottering on top of it as he sobbed. All I could do was stare into my uncle's cloudy eyes. Even with as far away as I was, I saw his eyes. They reminded me of the death stare of a fish gone belly up, with the wretched film that glazes the eyes upon a soul's departure. I would never forget the sound of my uncle's body and the sound that it made when he hit the ground like a bag of cement, a dull thump. My mother quickly turned me around, urging me down the trail with shaking hands placed upon my shoulders. I could still hear the sound of my father crying when we reached the car, pleading with God that somehow the Almighty One could breathe life again into the poor weary soul. I didn't know it then, but my uncle suffered from clinical depression. His son had disowned him, and his daughter had died in an automobile accident shortly before Uncle Sam killed himself. I had a few vague memories of him rattling around in my head, but whenever I thought of him, those eyes, those cold, dead eyes, were all I could see. I blinked again, and I was on the ground, crumpled in a heap with searing pain and wetness upon my back. I felt the sting of hot tears running down my face. I looked up, and there were two men dressed in white sheets. I looked at my hands, and they were the color of chocolate. Dirt had accumulated on my fingernails, as though I had spent a lifetime digging in the dirt with my hands, and there were calluses so deep the skin cracked around the heel of my palm and throughout my knuckles. I was dressed in a loose white shirt, stained with blood and tattered in the back. The breeze felt painful upon the open wounds that throbbed and stung. My head felt like it had been run against by a few fists. I looked up at one of the men and noticed a leather flail in his hand. In the other was a large knife. The man with him carried a rope slung over his shoulder, the noose prepared. "You know why you get to die now, don't you?" the man said with the knife. The man with the knife asked. His face was covered with a hood that was made into a point at the top, like a dunce cap. I swallowed hard and gritted my teeth, bearing down against my jaw to maintain silence. The last thing I wanted to do was provoke them. Bastards. The man with the rope laughed. "You're going to be swinging from their tree after what you did, and I reckon this tree here will be sending your soul right straight to hell, right where your kind belong." "What crime is it to fall in love?" My mouth moved, yet it wasn't my words or my voice speaking. I felt sickness rise in the pit of my stomach when I realized I was but a ghost in a shell. The voice was thick and raw and came out coarse as though someone had cleaned out my windpipe with a wire brush. "But love wasn't a crime. How could it be?" The man chuckled. "You ain't allowed to love nobody. Who in the hell do you think you are?" He spat in my face. I wiped the warm, slimy glob with the sleeve of my shirt. I pulled it away, and it was covered in blood and the man's sour mouth juice. I felt blood streaming down my face. The man with the knife came up to me and hit me with the butt of the tang. He then flipped it around and rammed it straight into my right eye and withdrew it, taking my eye out with it. No words could ever describe the amount of pain. But was it me who felt it? I cried out and felt my world spin. The sickness in my stomach was coming up in my throat, and I couldn't stop it. I lurched and felt the pressure in my head surge. As I vomited the contents of whatever was left in my stomach, the pressure in my head felt as though my wounds would explode and force blood out of them like a fountain. I felt a wave of vertigo, causing my remaining eye to roll back into my head. I collapsed to the left, pressing my palms into my empty eye socket. I let out a cry of pain and was rewarded with a series of kicks to the stomach and face. I was on my back, too weak and in agony to move. I hadn't the capacity to comprehend much as I lay there. I couldn't hear more than the dull murmurs of the two men laughing and yelling profanities at me. A face appeared within my mind, notably the smile of a woman who spread joy across her face. She was the daughter of the plantation owner, the man who owned me. My mind flashed a series of images, kisses in the rain in an open field with the sunrise throwing a golden spread across the tall wheat grass. Nights under the stars in the old barn as she taught me how to read by candlelight, casting out our shadows across the walls. I remembered how our shadows overlapped when we hunched over a book of poetry, and I reveled in the idea of being so close to her in that moment. Then there were the stolen glances, the drift of fingertips as we'd pass while caring for the horses. But then they saw us, our lips a breath apart and drifting closer. I'd never thought the closest we would ever be would have been those shadows cast by candlelight, the stolen moments and the soft curl of lips as we whispered, "I love you." An unfamiliar feeling came over me as I stared up into the canopy of maple leaves. It was a feeling I welcomed, the more it spread over me. I became sheathed within it as the feeling of euphoric dread crept across my body. My breathing slowed into a steady rhythm, contradictorily, that lulled me into a lugubriously sweet contentment. Or was it acceptance? The man with the rope lifted my head roughly and pulled the noose around my neck. I closed my eyes, and within those short moments were bubbles of dark time that could last a lifetime for the soul, yet but a few minutes in life. They could be found in the darkest, most cursed of places, areas of great emotional torment. I found myself moving through one of the dark pockets, time traveling by opening and closing my eyes. I felt a dark presence near, a shadowed entity curling through the branches like a smoky shadow whose fingers danced between the leaves in the canopy. I opened and closed my eyes again. They felt dry and itchy, but I lacked the strength to lift my hand to rub them. I was lying on the ground, staring at the canopy of maple leaves above. I turned my head, and my eyes found their way to my camp, the fire still licking the top of the wood. Everything was as it should be. I sighed in relief and lifted my torso to where I was sitting cross-legged in the middle of the square. Gizmo, go that way. Sorry. What in the hell just happened? I asked aloud, wondering if the maple trees would answer. I held my head in my hands for a moment. My gray matter was swirling with memories that didn't appear to be mine. I kept getting flashes of people, mostly faces, contorted in the arms of death, wrapped snugly with a noose. I also got flashes of darkness, sinister fingers grasping single leaves between smoky fingers, peering at me through the cracks in the bark with sticky blood sap running rivers down it like tears from 1,000 ghosts. My heart raced when a figure emerged from the woods on my left. She wore a long beige dress with an empire waist. Lace and pearls adorned the neckline, and the fabric flowed like ripples in water around her. Her hair was done up beautifully, dark brown curls framing her long, pale face. Her blue eyes were muffled by the swollen redness around them. As she drew closer, I noticed a piece of parchment she held in her hand. She observed the trees, paying no notice to me as I sat there with my mouth agape. This woman looked like she stepped out of a historical romance novel, and it was obvious to me she'd had her heart broken. The end was nigh. She stopped outside the square, looking up at the trees with tears streaming down her face. I put my hands on either side of my hips, positioning my legs underneath me, and lifted myself from the ground. Hey, are you okay, hun? I asked, my voice shaking. She didn't say a word in response. Instead, continued to stare into the canopy. With shaking hands and tentative steps, she closed her eyes and entered the square and disappeared. What the? My pulse quickened as I stumbled back and tripped over my own feet, then landed on my ass. I closed my eyes and brought my legs up to my chest, hugging them. I buried my face in my knees, trying to steady my breath. This was what I was here for. The rumors and stories were true about this place. My parents had known it. It's why they'd come out here, to write the story they never could. After my uncle's passing, they forgot the story and instead mourned the loss of Sam Cutler. The memory of him, to me, was ruined by the sight of those eyes of his. I remembered the jovial way he'd smile, his eyes brightening, making those wrinkles on his face appear less like age and more like the youthful character residing within him. He had battles we were unaware of, and the shock of finding out how much of a troubled soul he was devastated my family. My parents didn't know what drew people to the hanging trees, and I was determined to find out. I at first imagined the place to be like Dante's Inferno, but as I sat there, I was starting to believe it was a gateway to hell of some sort of purgatory that called out to weary souls and drew them close. I sensed the presence of something evil lurking nearby, watching me and calculating the means with which to seize my soul. I needed to get out of the square. I crawled backward, pushing the ground with my legs before turning over and standing. I rushed to the edge where the tall, supple grass met with the dry, prickly grass on the other side and slammed into an invisible barrier. I couldn't feel it with my hands. It was an emptiness that was impenetrable. I punched, kicked, hit the wall, and felt nothing. I was punching air, but my arm wouldn't go past the trees. I ran to the other side of the square and hit another wall of nothing. I ran my fingers through my hair, grabbing clumps and pulling at it as I dug my fingers in to my scalp. I turned around and around, my head doing somersaults in my rib cage, my heart doing somersaults in my rib cage. Cage. I was in a cage. My breathing was so sharp and rapid that I developed a stitch in my side. I reached under my breast and pressed on it in an attempt to slow my breathing and ease the muscle cramping. I squeezed my eyes shut and held tight to my body, wrapping my arms around myself. I felt naked. It was watching me, whatever it was, and wherever it was. I heard twigs snap behind me in the brush along the clearing. I listened to the song of the robins and chickadees as they fluttered back and forth between the trees and heard the crackle of the fire from my camp. The grass felt damp and cold beneath my bare feet, and I regretted not putting shoes on. I imagined the square littered with bodies and blood and my bare feet soaking up the remnants of those poor souls. The reality of the horror of death lit another wave of panic, like a candle refusing to be snuffed. People died here. Many people. My uncle died here. A black slave was beaten bloody and hanged here by an anonymous clan member. A young man was murdered here, stabbed and hung for some unknown reason. I could still feel his hand upon my shoulder and instinctually wiped the feeling away with my hand. I also felt a sting behind my right eye, the same eye that was torn out with a knife when I had been the slave. When I had been the slave. Had I? Was I? I opened my eyes. It was twilight and my camp was gone. I noticed something different about the trees. They seemed younger. I wasn't sure how I knew, but I did. Some of the branches wove together, intertwined and braided in areas, quite different from a few moments ago. The wind blew, but the leaves didn't rustle. It was like they were stuck in a suspended animation. I saw a glimpse of the smoke phantom again, and I watched as it climbed above me, darkening the patches of sky I could see through the leaves. I watched as it crawled slowly and silently across the branches. I felt forsaken, lost, consumed with the desire to end my suffering. I felt larger, taller, and uncomfortable in this new body. My legs were long as were my arms. My shoulders were broad, and my stomach protruded from my waist. My forearms appeared to be part bare, with all the dark hair curling and twisting upon it. I had a hard-working man's hands, covered in blisters, splinters, calluses, and cracks. My heart seemed to have stopped sprinting completely, halted as though a pair of hands had clutched it in my chest, forcing the hammering into a self-complacent beat. Images flashed in my mind, cloudy picture reels of a little girl, probably in her 20s, running through the yard, playing tag with her best friend, a teenage boy about the same age. I felt myself smile as I stood aside to watch them skip in the woods. When the sun went behind a dark, steel gray cloud, an ominous feeling brushed against my soul. The next image was a man wearing faded leather boots frayed along the top in a perfect circle near the toe. The next image was a man and a woman dangling from the maple tree farthest from where my camp would be set up. Two little dolls strung up like disturbing marionettes, their chins touching their chest as though in silent prayer. The loss filled me with enough grief that I too desired to succumb to the end. But first I had to endure a barrage of memories, memories that stuck out like a boulder protruding from the ground, the truth only half buried. Recollections took initiative to our actions. We swallowed them like pills, gulping down the bitter liquid and feeling them collect into a ball at the back of our throat. And no matter how hard we tried to swallow, we choked on it until it deteriorated our psyche and drove us to our breaking point. I stared at my two best friends in shock. The man was dressed in cotton slacks and a shirt, while the young woman wore a cotton dress with roses embroidered along the hem. Both had dark blonde hair. Thankfully, they were at an angle to where I couldn't see their faces. My friends, the only friends I had in the world, were no more. I couldn't comprehend this. My mind drifted into a haze as the world spun around me. Someone had done this, but who? I spun around, holding my head, searching in a wild panic for the culprit. This wasn't real. My head swirled, and the world fell around me like a shattered mirror upon a wall. My mouth dropped open, and I tried to cry out in anguish, but couldn't. The only sound that came was a silent scream that sputtered and cracked in my throat. I felt the muscles in my face contract, my fist balling up in my hair, pulling at it in white rage. A familiar feeling. Didn't I just... I felt my hand reach into the back pocket where I withdrew a small knife. The body I was trapped inside walked into the square. I tried to fight him, urge him, or myself, whatever I had become, out of the square. "Don't go, please!" I screamed in his head. It was an exercise in futility as he stepped over the threshold of the hanging trees. With my arms outstretched, I took both pairs of legs in my arms and pulled them toward me, tears streaming down my face as I whimpered. How could this have happened? Had they planned this? But if so, why? How could something so drastic happen in a matter of seconds? The answer came to me in the most peculiar of ways when a rope fell from the branch next to me, striking me on my upper arm. I turned my head, my eyes blurred from tears, and held tighter to my friend's legs. We had grown up together, you see, best friends from the moment we first said hello, and we were inseparable. They were in love, but it was I who loved the both of them the most, and now they were gone. My vision fell away, and the colors began to run like bright red paint against an old barn. The rush of love and loss I felt for them surprised me for some reason, and to what lengths I would go to spend eternity with them as well. I reached out and gripped the noose in one hand and placed it around my neck. I felt the rope yank against the back of my ears as the slack was pulled. I looked up and saw it, a misplaced shadow where the sunlight should be. It was death, come to claim my soul and the souls of my two favorite people. The rope pulled taut against my neck. I was lifted slowly, and I followed the pull with my feet until I was off the ground. I looked at my friends with their heads resting against the rope and felt the pressure of the noose around my neck, squeezing out the last breath I would ever take. I struggled against it, my eyes never leaving them. I felt their loss far deeper than any other I had ever felt. I couldn't live in a world where they didn't exist. I couldn't. I wouldn't. I felt my pulse thundering in my ears as a light tingling took over, and a wave of fresh fear came over me. I grappled for the rope above me as my body flailed in a panic. I closed my eyes, and I was in the grass next to a patch of daisies in the corner opposite my camp. I didn't remember walking there. I tried to swallow, but couldn't. I tried to talk, yell, and then scream, yet no sound came, and the attempts only caused more pain. Breathing through my nose hurt, but breathing through my mouth felt like murder. Air hurt. I needed water, but I left my water bottle on the ground just inside the tent. My body ached, and the pain in my right eye was there enough to remind me I had gouged it out a lifetime ago. Exhausted and in pain, I went to my hands and knees and crawled slowly across the plush grass, crushing daisies and bending the succulent blades of grass as I went along. I had to stop every few feet. Moving seemed to make me nauseous and dizzy. Breathing was slow and calculated intakes of breath, and my lungs felt like I had swallowed gasoline and flicked a bic. When I had made it to the maple tree facing my camp, I used the trunk for support and forced myself to my feet. Thirsty. So thirsty. I reached out with my hand to touch the air, blocking my passage to my camp, and hung my head in defeat. Was I to be trapped here forever, destined to relive the agonizing memories of horrible deaths? My hand slid down the trunk of the tree slightly, the bark underneath my hand crumbling and falling away like ash from my fingertips. I inspected my hand and rubbed my fingers together. Ash. Curious. I peeled off more of the bark, and it too fell away like ash. An idea formed in my head. Yes, that was it. I propped myself against the tree with both hands and began clawing at the bark. When I got far enough in, I reached with my fingers and started forcing out chunks, breaking it off by cupping my hand and gripping with my fingers to snap it off. Ash covered the front of me and floated in the air, landing on my arms and the tops of my knees as I bent them forward. Ash swept into my face and I breathed it in and choked, instinctually turning my head and coughing. I regretted it instantly. I tried to move my tongue around in my mouth enough to produce some saliva to coat my throat and wash the particles of an internally combusted maple tree down, and failed. I swallowed anyways and forced myself not to cry out in pain. I felt tears welling in my eyes as I swallowed again and again. I didn't want to, but I had to get the ash out from the back of my throat. I pulled my shirt up and over my mouth and nose and continued digging at the tree. I tore it at the trunk with my fingers, forcing my nails into the crevices and pulling out chunks until I dug deep enough to where I could sit on the edge of the hole I'd made. I felt a thick layer of ash on my face that caked in some places from the beads of sweat. I felt it on my eyelashes, and every so often I would stop to wipe one eye at a time with the bottom inside of my shirt. I dug for what I assumed was an hour. The sun hadn't moved, and the logs on my fire hadn't diminished in the least, so it was hard to tell. I was stuck in a bubble of hell on earth. The stories were true, yet people kept coming here thinking it would be different for them. Or people came because they thought it had to be an urban legend and simply a common place to commit suicide. There were some who would come in droves who were curious as I was. No article was worth this. How could I have been so foolish? I should have known better. I should have remembered what happened to my Uncle Sam. I understood why I had suppressed it. What child wouldn't? It all came flooding back to me, though. The therapy, the fights between Mom and Dad over a note. Probably the one he left before he came to end his life in the hanging trees. It was a popular place. They didn't go to the funeral, and they hadn't talked about Uncle Sam too much after he died. I think it was too painful for my dad to think about. Sam was his only brother, and they had been close all of their lives. Best friends as well as brothers, or so I was told. I grew up and forgot about him, though, and he faded into the dark recesses of my mind for good reason. I could see the years in the pieces of tree I dug out, the layers of compressed ash of varying gradient, reminding me of phyllodoe, with how thin they were. Usually one could tell the age of a tree by looking at the rings, but there were hundreds, thousands perhaps, and I wasn't even a quarter of the way through. These trees were ancient, older than humans, older than even dinosaurs perhaps. I remembered hearing about the ancient tree in California, a great bristlecone pine somewhere in the White Mountains. It was considered the oldest living tree in the world and had a lifespan of roughly 5,000 years. Yet here were four maple trees whose age exceeds the bristlecone by 5 times that, give or take a few millennia. Sorry, how do you adjust? I pulled away in surprise when my fingers touched something I hadn't expected. Although the world had become a dismal gray upon entering the square, it was still light enough for me to see. I stepped out from behind my shadow and allowed the light to shine into it. I turned my head to the side and leaned in, inspecting the substance. It was russet in color and highly viscous. Sap. I raked my hands down the inside of the tree and found out soon enough that the center of it was a cylinder of primordial sap. Well, that ain't right. I slapped my forehead lightly. Nothing about this is right. Nothing. I was trapped. The cylinder of sap was wide enough to where there was no way, even if I were to dig out either side of the tree, for me to escape. I whirled around, intending to try the spaces between the other trees, knowing full well I would face the same barrier, but I had to at least try. I turned around to find that there was no trail leading to where I'd crawled from. Every daisy head was bobbing with the wind, and every blade of grass was unmolested. 166 pounds of me had crawled across the grass like Godzilla to a bug, and not a single blade of grass was as much as bent. What the actual fuck? I mouthed. I dared not utter a word if I didn't want to feel the searing pain in my esophagus. I shook my head and turned back toward the tree and fell backward, then crawled away from it. The tree was whole. I looked at my clothes, and they were clean and ash-free, as they were when I had been stupid enough to hike into this godforsaken forest. I got to my feet again and walked toward the tree to place my hand on it. It was solid, and the bark only flaked away as a normal tree would when I ran my finger across it. It's toying with me. I hadn't tried the other openings between the other maples. I knew it would turn out the same way, but it was worth a shot. I turned around again, facing the open square, when I saw it. The maple's straight trunks had morphed to where faces protruded from the bark, faces whose jaws were set in a permanent silent scream. Men, women, and children's faces circled the whole of the trunk, intertwining and moving slowly across them like a body drawn down a slow current of water. My breath caught in my throat when I turned my head to peer beside me. Faces and heads protruded out from the maple I had just dug out and moved like the others, faces appearing and disappearing as the bark itself moved. One of the faces turned its gnarled head and looked directly at me and moving. I walked away slowly, my eyes never leaving the wooden face staring at me. It looked familiar, which made it all the more unsettling. I could have sworn it was my Uncle Sam. I felt sick again, this time more of an emotional sickness, nailing me right in the stomach, sending waves of anxiety through me. No, not him. It couldn't be. I didn't want it to be. What the fresh hell is this? Even if I lived to write the article on this place, who would believe me? I heard a sudden whoosh of fabric from behind me, followed by a loud crack and the creaking sound of a tight rope above a branch. I turned to look, and it was a woman wearing a wedding dress, her face bowed like the rest of them. She had hair like fire that sparkled in the dreary atmosphere, and I saw mascara running like gray rivers down her cheeks. He cheated on me. I can't believe he left me on our wedding day for my best friend. An all too familiar feeling. It was her that last thought. I saw his face in my mind, a dashing man with dark brown hair that he wore in a ponytail at the nape of his neck. He was a musician, and we were going to travel the world and share our music. I was a singer, his little canary. I was looking for her when I opened the door and saw them. It was Peter all over again. How I felt this woman's anguish, and I couldn't help wonder if I came here not to write, but to end my own suffering. Maybe in some ways I asked for this. I watched as her body gently rocked back and forth, the creaking of the branch against her weight a rhythm of death. I reached out to touch the hem of her dress and felt nothing. My hand went straight through her, but she appeared before me as though she were solid. Was I the ghost now? I heard rustling within the woods all around me as people started filling in from each side. Some had notes in their hands, which they pinned to themselves before they used a log that appeared, the same log my father used to cut down my uncle, to hoist themselves up into the trees. They died at their own pace, some rereading their suicide note while others threw ropes into the branches above. In some areas, the rope just appeared, like what happened to the man whose best friends hung themselves. They were all dressed as though going to a costume party, various people from various walks of life, various colors, and innumerable circumstances. Whoosh, crack, whoosh, crack, whoosh, crack. Some came while being escorted at gunpoint, while most came of their own volition. Some I noticed stumble into the square by accident, trapped like I was, and fighting like I did, until I noticed them staring off into space as if in some sort of trance. They would rouse from their reveries and panic, clawing at the invisible barrier and calling out for help. They came by the droves, and all I heard were the creaking sounds of rope, the rustle of fabric, and the crack of their neck when they kicked the log out of the way and snapped their own necks. I started getting flashes of memories from all of them, like my predecessors, my mind flying from one person to the next in rapid succession, and I couldn't identify whose memories were whose. I blinked and I was a woman dying from disease. My hands were shaking as I brought up my hand to my chest to touch my heart. I could feel the breeze as it tickled that bandana I wore to hide my balding head. My hands were soft and the skin was so thin it was nearly threadbare. I felt another hand lace fingers through my own, and I looked up to see him there. I was overjoyed yet saddened by the loss. His eyes were as blue as the summer sky back in Georgia where we had grown up. I remember the young man he used to be, proud and strong. I had an overwhelming urge to kiss his wrinkled lips. He was a jovial man, always contented by my presence. But I was dying. I could feel it in my bones, and this man refused to let me face death alone. We had agreed to go together. Now we had a time frame, so we decided for our anniversary we would. I blinked again, and I was the man who was facing felony drug charges and was coming to terms with the idea of prison time. I was on the corner of the street in the alleyway out on bond where I helped a lost soul shoot up behind a dumpster. The man looked to be in his late 50s with a long gray beard and hair and beard. He wore a thick winter coat he probably got second-hand. I watched as he fumbled with the jacket, trying to get his right arm out of the sleeve. It was cold out and I could taste ice in the air. I helped him tie the tourniquet and watched as he inserted the pre-filled needle I withdrew from the inside of my jacket. I left him with the needle still stuck in his arm, the old man's eyes rolling back in his head in some sort of ecstatic bliss. I heard him coughing, hacking up bile and foaming at the mouth. The man crawled out from behind the dumpster with his hand outstretched before he fell to the ground dead. I kept walking, thumbing the wad of money he'd given me. I blinked. I was sitting in a familiar dining room with my knees apart in an uncomfortable wooden chair. My brother and sister-in-law were in the other room discussing travel plans while I bounced my niece up on my knee. The table was littered with snack wrappers, half-empty bags of chips, and 15 empty beer cans lined across the table. A curious feeling came over me, a familiar one I had just experienced. The little girl had long brown hair that had strands of what looked like spun gold in it. She wore a cute little white cotton dress. It was Sunday. They had come over after church. Then she fell from my lap. She hit her head on the hard, sharp edge of the table and looked at me, blinking slowly, her eyes rolling around trying to find a fixed point. The little girl turned her head to look at me, and I realized I was looking at myself. A wave of panic, more powerful than anything I had experienced, clutched every muscle in my body. I blinked, then looked up at him from the floor. I remember how kind his eyes were, but in that moment they were red. He looked as though he wasn't all there at all upstairs. My younger self sat there, and I looked about the room. I held my head instinctually as another form appeared in the hallway, identical to me. I had a twin. He was my uncle. He'd promised me he wouldn't hurt me. I felt like retching, and then I did. I looked back down at the little girl on the floor as her eyes slowly opened and closed until they remained closed. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. How could I have been lied to for so many years? How could they? I blinked and I was facing the hanging trees. I was holding a note in my hand and I stepped into the fresh green grass. I folded it and placed it in my breast pocket, making sure the note was sticking out far enough for someone to notice. I was filled with guilt from allowing a dear innocent to fall from my lap. I could still hear the dull thump from her head when her head hit the edge of the table. My father had found the note. It was the suicide note he had left admitting his guilt and his unwillingness to live with it. That's why my parents never went to the funeral and why he wasn't talked about while I was growing up. It was an accident that haunted the family in the shadows. Perhaps they didn't want me to grow up with survivor's guilt. Maybe they were trying to protect me, but why? I had a sister, a twin, a second me, and now she was gone. And here I was over 20 years later, and I'm mourning her for the first time. I closed my eyes and tried to swallow, but couldn't. I looked down and noticed a noose around my neck, and my first thought was, I wish I had brought a knife. Had I just put it around my neck? How could I have? It wasn't me. It was my uncle. I was standing atop the large log that had appeared beside me. The shadow crept across the branches, blocking out blotches of gray sunshine, and took hold of the rope and began to pull. Was I me, or was I my uncle? Who was I? My thoughts drifted to Peter and how much I had loved that man. I was devoted to him and gave him my all. I never in a million years would have thought he and Sarah would blindside me the way they had. I found myself brimming with hatred and anguish. He told me he wanted to marry me just last week. He promised me forever, and I'd fallen for it. I felt the guilt of every soul course through my veins, wrapping their worst memories through my DNA, until I was part of it all, a part of all of them, losing my identity completely as the images continued flooding my mind. I was the man from MIT who couldn't cope with the demands of the curriculum and was failing miserably. I was the woman whose lover killed her parents. I was the girl who just wanted to end an end to the suffering from self-hatred and depression. I was the kid picked on in school who had enough. I was the transgender teenager whose parents wouldn't accept them. I was the old woman who lost her beloved of 30-some years. I was the alcoholic uncle standing atop of an upturned log waiting for the courage to fall. I felt my breast pocket and found the note sticking out before I teetered from side to side, trying to knock the log over. The world grew quiet around me. Only the hum of crickets was my death knell, and the cold-knuckled embrace of the shadowy specter who was waiting for me with open arms. Who was I now? I was everyone consumed by pain, looking for release by means of the hanging trees. I closed my eyes, and I was huddled on the ground. A stray hand was placed upon my shoulder, causing me to jump in alarm. Tears streaked my flushed cheeks. I looked upwards and saw Peter. I looked past him and saw her. I looked at my camp and then back at Peter with my mouth agape. Are you okay? He asked, lifting his feet to the square. The sound of 2 ropes falling from the branches came from behind me, and I felt the edge of my lips curl. The end. That is The Hanging Trees. Thank you for watching, listening, and hope you enjoyed it. There are more stories that I will share with you at another point. I will be back later to do another video on human trafficking. If you like this story, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe, and tell me what you think about it in the comments. Also, if you have any suggestions on any ideas on what stories you'd like to what type of stories you'd like to hear me read or write, just let me know in the comments and whatnot, and I'll see what I can come up with. Anyways, you guys take care. Thank you again for spending time with me, and I will talk to you in the next one. You guys have a good day. Bye.